Sorry to be the person standing between you guys and more drinks. I am also going to do a little bit of audience participation. So I'm going to talk about jobs to be done. Who's familiar with jobs to be done as a framework? Ooh, a lot of people. Okay. Who's using it right now? That's interesting. And who's a fan? Interesting. Okay, all over the place. So, I'm going to tell a little bit of a personal story. I've kind of a love-hate relationship with jobs to be done. In fact, for a long time, that's probably not true. For a long time, I actually probably hated it. And this is really just a little bit of a story of how I've come to understand it a bit better and integrate it into how I'm going to think about product going forward. So, a little bit of a story. I'll make it quick because I think you do it fast. So, about a decade ago, I was meeting with an executive for the first time. His company had just acquired my startup. And within 5 minutes, he starts explaining to me the only way to do innovation successfully was to use jobs to be done. And the interesting thing was his company had just paid a lot of money for our startup. And we had managed to innovate a whole new category in the industry. And as far as I could tell, they had innovated almost nothing in the previous 10, 20 years. So I was like, how can you be telling me? I just didn't compute. So that was interesting. But I was like, okay, let me go and look at this thing. And I went back to my desk, looked at the framework that they used, and I looked at it and I was like, this is just reinventing the wheel and on needs-based segmentation, things like that, except for some other statements it made, and I'm fairly confident those are wrong, in my opinion. So I was like, what is this thing? Anyway, that was my first encounter with a jobs to be done evangelist. I've continued to meet them. I actually met one a couple of weeks ago, a guy hiring for a job, and he said he only wanted people who lived and breathed jobs to be done. So it seems to attract some real evangelists, and I kind of, I had sort of put it aside all those years ago, but having encountered it again more recently, I wanted to dig into it and kind of reconcile. What was this thing that people put so much emphasis on that I had kind of found no value in? So let me just take you through, really this is almost a personal research project. I'm going to kind of report out on what I've found and sort of cut to the chase. So I'm not going to destroy jobs to be done, and I actually think it's a super valuable framework, but I think it's really important to understand exactly what it is and how you should think about it. And in fact, there's more than one kind of jobs to be done. So let me explain what I mean. So look, the core idea is really powerful. This is actually the example from Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Solution, but it's a really good one. It's a great one to start with. He has the example of a fast food company in the US that was trying to understand a pattern where it was selling milkshakes, and it was selling a ton of them in the afternoon after kids finished school, but it was also selling them in the morning, like when kids should already be at school. It's like, what's going on? So they went and found the people who were making these purchases, and they sort of used the jobs to be done approach and sort of said, what job is this milkshake doing for you? And they discovered that I think everybody understands the sort of kids' use case, it's a treat after school, but the adults were buying these milkshakes for a completely different job. It was a little bit of something to keep them amused on their commute. It was a little bit, a bit of a treat in the morning. And then some of them was even kind of a snack to keep them going through like in mid-morning or even late morning before they get to lunch. So like just totally different jobs for this pretty simple product. And I think it's probably pretty intuitive that if you were to like dig in and try to optimize and drive sales against those two use cases, like you do completely different things for the two. That's pretty powerful. Like that framing. Now, could you just say, well, what do you need it for? Or what is this for? I mean, I think you could, but there's something quite powerful about that framing of what is the job to be done. I think it sort of makes you state it anew. It makes you kind of, I think it actually, particularly in a consumer context, but I think even more broadly, it makes you separate the underlying need. Makes you really think, well, what's the underlying need here? What is the job? Like, say it in different words to just the way that we talk about it all the time. Like, and even in a B2B context, like, if you ask the question, what is the real job here? You might have been saying, well, we're I need to file a form, but maybe the job is to be compliant or something like that. It can help, it seems to help people ask a more profound question. And if that tool works, then I think that's pretty powerful. Now, with that said, people have taken this framework a long way. So this is one version of jobs to be done. And I think I can provide the link so you can dig in. They have really driven this far, really almost down to a science of how to ask the question of, for a given group of customers, what is the job they need to be done? But what are the needs that come out of that, all the way through the buying and purchase process. They've thought through different types of users, the buyer, the user, the support desk. Honestly, if you follow this approach, you will have a really great piece of insight into your product. I think that's definitely true. It'll be very rigorous, and it's definitely a tool that can uncover some things that would not have been obvious. So now, a little bit of a but. That's all true, but it turns out people don't exactly agree on what jobs to be done is. So here's a number of different versions of jobs to be done. On the left there, you've got kind of the OG. Then you've Clayton Christensen. You've got a couple more guys who both claim to have worked a lot with Clayton Christensen and have kind of put their own spin on it. And then it sort of continues. Intercom, the popular chat customer service software, actually published their own book, published a book on their own approach to this. And they're starting, as you come from left to right, they're starting to become quite different. Clayton Christensen and the guys on the left, pretty oriented around the idea of finding a job to be done as a situation that a certain group of customers have a certain need, and therefore finding a way to serve that. By the time you get to this end, so it's actually an argument for more sophisticated segmentation on the left. By the time you get to this end, you're almost at the point of segmentation doesn't matter, just figure out who it is you're serving and then map out the job for them. And it's almost like an anti-segmentation story. I think they would say that's a bit strong, but I suspect that that's how it's been interpreted by some people who've used some of these approaches. So that's just to say, if you are going to go down this path, I think it's really important to understand what you're trying to achieve and what version of jobs to be done is right for what you're trying to achieve. And I think the way I think about it is to sort of try to reconcile all this in my mind. This is kind of the original version of it was very strategic. It's actually a search for finding an opportunity in the market where a certain group of people with a certain need in a certain situation can then have a product that's valuable built for them. And the target customer isn't known at the beginning of that process. It comes out of that. And as I said, it's pretty involved. If you go through the full thing, it's complex, multi-stage. It could take many months. It could take pretty substantial research projects. And the product, I think, the methodology is very sound and rigorous, and you can come up with some really great insights. But it is a lot, and it is appropriate for when you're working on what is the fundamental positioning of a product or a company, and where are we going to play in that market? I mean, it's a really great way to do that. I suspect that that is often not how jobs to be done is used. I think it's often used in a much more tactical way, where you're kind of assuming the customers, probably the ones your company already has, and you're just using some of the higher level frameworks, things at the beginning of the process to just map out what it is the customer does, and maybe just push a bit further to not just what did they say they need to do, but what's the real need. I think that's great. I think both of these are very valuable analytical approaches. I just think they're quite different, and it's important to understand what exactly you're trying to achieve, and therefore what version of this sort of family of frameworks you want to use. So that's sort of my first takeaway from this is, both are useful, but understand what it is you're trying to do. The second thing I would say is, I think it's quite tempting when you've mapped out a job into its stages, and then you've mapped out the needs or the big framework I showed earlier talks about outcome statements. You've mapped out the outcome statements, and you found the ones that are not met very well. It's quite tempting to say, okay, well, what we need to do is go and meet all these needs, and then our customer will be super successful. It's not quite as simple as that. I think it's important to remember just because you can add more features doesn't mean your product is getting better. There's the risk that you're creating product, the dreaded product bloat. And then even if all the features are pointing, well, that's true if all the features are pulling in the same direction. But sometimes the features may not be pulling in the same direction, or rather the outcomes. The customers may say they want A and B, but actually the perfect solution for A is going to preclude a good solution for B, and vice versa. That's very, very possible. So just because you can map these outcomes doesn't mean you can then go and deliver them all. And then, look, let's be realistic. Even if you found the perfect sort of intersection of here's a need, here's a job to be done, and let's build it. You can't always say, let's build our company around this. You may find that we can't build a big enough business on that. You may find that your company already has 2 or 3. You're already serving 2 or 3 jobs to be done. So the framework is a helpful insight, but it isn't necessarily going to give you all the answers. So I think that's an important, just recognizing this is kind of a pre-step. You can map all the needs in a market, but you then need to think about what you're actually going to deliver against those. What's the right thing for the business? And then just to raise that up a level, if you're working on more strategic topics particularly, not only should you not, probably, as I said on the previous slide, you can't necessarily meet all the needs, but actually you probably shouldn't try to. So, I mean, the essence of strategy, if you believe Michael Porter and people like that, is that you should be looking for ways to deliver a valuable product, find a valuable product that people want that no other company can compete with you. And how do you do that? You do that by choosing to do different things. And then the classic example of this that Michael Porter uses and others do is a company like IKEA. Think back sort of 20 or 30 years ago when IKEA entered the market. You had a bunch of high street stores. They valued things like they would deliver to your home, they'd deliver an assembled piece of furniture, and IKEA came in and said, we're not going to do any of that. You're going to take it, we're going to not do those things, but what we are going to do is let you take it home today, and you can have it assembled and ready for your child to sleep in by the end of the day. And we'll actually have a much bigger assortment as well, because we're going to let you walk through our whole warehouse to do that. Totally different way to build a product. The traditional stores couldn't replicate this at all without basically rebuilding their own version of IKEA, which would have no synergy with their core product. So I think that's a great example of you can understand all the needs that are out there for a job, but you can choose not to serve all those needs and actually to create a powerful product from choosing which ones you want to serve and knitting together a business model that serves them really powerfully. Now, I will say, if everyone here is in tech, this can be a little harder to do in software in particular, whereas a little less, generally speaking, software is extensible. It's harder to create a really hard distinction between your competitors, but it's kind of like a sort of platonic ideal of how do you make a really profitable business. You should be looking for ways, at least consider, are there ways to do things differently? I'm going to get really good at this, and my competitor can't follow me without losing what they're good at. If you can find those things, it's really powerful. So I think if you're mapping all the things your customer needs, choosing unusual ways to meet those needs or unusual groups of needs to meet, I think can be really powerful, and that should be something we try to bear in mind. So with all that said, I think I probably, hopefully you see my view now. I think processed correctly, I think jobs to be done is very powerful. I do want to sort of finish by saying it's not the only way to do these things. If you dive into some of these frameworks, they're quite interview and survey centric, and they don't preclude alternate approaches, like maybe something like deep ethnography, observing your users, or iterative product testing, observing the feedback, but they don't tend to lead you in that direction. So I think if you are diving into these frameworks, I think it's good to remember there's more than one way to understand what your customers need. And I think it's entirely legitimate to take some of these other approaches and integrate them into a discovery as to what job you're trying to support. So in summary, that's hopefully that was a decently coherent sort of summary of how I've thought about this. Look, it's a pretty powerful framework. There's almost a bit of an alchemy, like by asking that question, what's the jobs to be done, people seem to get to answers they wouldn't get to. And if it works for you, I absolutely would endorse it. And I think there are some phenomenal frameworks out there that can be used. But if you are diving into it, like understand what it is you're trying to do and use the version of it that makes sense for you. I do think then when you've got your insights, think about trade-offs. Like you can't just add all the features. That shouldn't be the goal. And at a more strategic level, like strategy isn't about doing everything. It's about doing certain things. And yeah, don't forget there are other ways as well. So that's all I have.